Since the leak of the Supreme Court's draft decision that would overturn the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision permitting abortion at the federal level across the United States, abortion is once again taking center stage in American discourse. Abortion rates across the U.S. have actually declined in recent decades, but percentages in racial disparity remain about the same. According to the most recent information available from the Kaiser Family Foundation, of all abortions performed in the US, 38% are Black women, 33% are white, 21% are Hispanic, and 7% are other, which is where Asian women, Native American women, and those who identify as hailing from the Asian continent altogether fall. Just 7% of all abortions in the US are undertaken by those in the AAPI community. It's worth noting that AAPI people make up just 6% of the total US population. Meanwhile, a recent Ipsos poll finds that perceptions about abortion are shifting in the East as well as the West. South Koreans polled about whether abortions should remain legal saw a 20% shift in the yes column. Russia saw a 9% uptick, and India saw 2%. On the flip side, the UK saw a 5% decline in support for legal abortions, France down 9% in support, and Turkey down 15%. So, what is driving these shifts in opinion, especially in Asia, where most countries allow abortion, but with certain limitations, like Iran, a country many in the West view as restrictive in the way of women's rights? For that, let's turn to Professor Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. Professor, thank you for making time in joining me today. Normally, when I talk to you, we're talking about foreign policy, the JCPOA, sanctions, things of that nature. But today, we'll be taking a departure from that. Today, we'll discuss social issues and culture, especially surrounding abortion. But first, I'd like to establish a few things to the viewers. Since you're a
Sure.
professor, let's do an Iran 101. First, is Iran part of Asia?
It is definitely a part of Asia. At least that's where it was last time I saw.
Yes, I think a lot of people fail to remember that the Asian continent is very large. It is a big continent, and Iran is part of that.
That's
Now,
right. It's in West Asia.
West Asia. Now, I've also heard a lot of debate about this one. Are the people Iranians or are they called Persians? And if you can explain the difference to us.
Iranians call themselves Iranians, and the term Persian is rather old. And at a certain point in Iranian history, the Iranian government called upon the international community to uh, refer to the country as Iran. After the revolution, because of the antagonism towards many Iranians in the United States, uh, people in the United States were angry, many at least, over the hostage crisis, which itself was a result of the U.S. support for the Shah, and who was a mass murderer in the eyes of Iranians. They gave him refuge in the United States, and that led to the embassy takeover. So the Iranians saw the United States as helping a mass murderer, allowing him to take billions of dollars of Iranian assets. And this, of course, the embassy takeover caused a lot of anger among ordinary Americans because the media in the United States was, as usual, very one sided. So, ordinary Iranians in the United States, many of them were harassed, and a trend began where many Iranians in the United States, Iranian Americans, began to call themselves Persians because I think it made them feel more secure. And the word Persian also has certain exotic attributes and positive connotations in the eyes of many people.
Ah, I see. So this all really began in the 70s, so it wasn't always that way.
That's right. It began in the United States in at the end of the 70s, and it increased in the 80s. But in Iran, people don't call themselves Persians; they call themselves Iranian.
Good to know. What about the language of Iran? What is the official language, or are there different dialects spoken there?
Well, the official language that is taught at school and at university, or the language used to teach at school and university, is Farsi, which is also called Persian in abroad. We say Farsi in Iran, but there are multiple languages. Azeri is one. It is a large segment of Iranian society. The Iranian population is Azeri. I am partially Azeri. My family name, Marandi, means that I'm from the city of Marand, which is a city close to Tabriz, a very Azerbaijani city. So we have the Azeri language, we have the Kurdish language, we have the Arabic language, and we have different dialects. So it is a very diverse country.
Right. I think it's also a lot bigger than people imagine, uh, which explains a lot of different dialects. What about religion? Is there an official religion of Iran?
Iran is a Muslim country. It is overwhelmingly Muslim. Um, the overwhelming majority of the Muslims are Shia Muslims, so it is a Shia country according to the constitution. But all of the Sunni schools, the four traditional Sunni schools, are recognized in Iran. Their jurisprudence and religious rights are respected in areas which are predominantly Sunni. Uh, their religious regulations are the ones that are adhered to and carried out by the public sector. In the Constitution, since we have a very small Jewish minority and a small Christian minority, we have um, a the Constitution designates seats in Parliament for
Hmm.
the Jews and Christians and Zoroastrian. So uh, roughly 10% of the population in Iran is Sunni Muslim, and the roughly 10% of the parliament is also Sunni Muslim. And we have five minority MPs, uh, three Christian, two I think are Armenian, and one Jewish, and I think one or two Zoroastrian. But I may be wrong with the numbers, but it's roughly correct.
So it's reflective of the population in Iran.
Well, not for the minorities. The Christian and Jewish minorities are definitely a lot less than their percentage in parliament, but uh, they have that privilege. In even if there's just one, hypothetically, of course, even if there's just one Christian or one Jew in Iran, that person would go to parliament.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I think something a lot of people don't even consider when they think of Iran. They think, only the Ayatollah, they think Shia Muslim, and that's it. So I think that was an important thing to point out, is that there are a multitude of people within the parliament of differing religious backgrounds.
Yes,
Now,
they
another thing.
during Christmas they sell Christmas
Ah,
trees. Of course, most Christians here are Armenian, so Christmas is in January, and we
Orthodox,
have kosher. Yes, and the Orthodox Christians, the date is very similar
right?
to the Armenians and are very close. And we have kosher restaurants in Tehran. So yeah, it's very different from what I think most people in the United States and Europe would imagine,
Yeah.
based on Western media narratives.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's important for people to hear that from somebody that lives there, that has also lived in the US. Um, in now also in the West, people often think of Iran as, this because of media representation. They think of it as this cruel Muslim state. Women have no rights. They can't do this. They can't do that. But is that really the case, especially as it pertains to abortion?
The law in Iran is that if the fetus has serious problems, up to the fourth month, it can be aborted. There can be the mother, the female, the pregnant woman can have an abortion, or if her life is at risk, uh, and of course doctors acknowledge that, or then up to 4 months that the fetus can be aborted. So that does exist. Otherwise, Iranian law uh, does not support abortion under uh, those. Let's say if a 4-month-old
Mhm.
fetus is aborted, that would be illegal. If it was a fetus that where no harm was to be, there was no threat for the mother, or the
Right.
fetus was not in any way abnormal, that would be illegal. But it's not. It would not be considered murder unless it's at a later stage. So the it is more conservative, but there are let's say more, but there are it is different from many other countries in this part of the world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
they're more the
Professor,
fetus. If there's a problem or if the mother is in danger, then they can have an abortion.
from what you've described, Iran's stance, the state stance on abortion, doesn't stray very far from the limitations that places like Texas or Georgia have placed on abortion here in the US. So when you start thinking of it in that terms, um, it kind of goes to show that Iran isn't what the media has portrayed Iran to be, especially in terms of women's choice and what have you, because you can see the same types of laws here in the US, in the continental US. But what about the people? Do the people there agree with that? Is abortion widely accepted by women there? Do they support it?
I haven't seen the latest polls. I think that most people probably support the law as it is, but I'm
Mhm.
speculating here. So if I knew you were going to ask this question, I would have looked it up. But what I could say in as a footnote is that in the public sector, if a woman is pregnant and she has a child, she gets a 1 year leave. So one of my colleagues, she gave birth to her child last year, and she only returned back to work 2 weeks ago,
So there's a
and
great
she's fully paid.
right. Wow. Great support system for people that for women that do have children. It's not like here in the US where we don't have maternity leave at all.
No, they get one in the public sector, and we have a large public sector. They get a 1 year leave, and as I said, they are fully paid.
Wow. Yeah, we definitely do not have that in the US. You're lucky if your employer pays you even half your salary for a few weeks as you recover. But that's a whole different conversation to be had. More on the social views, Professor. There's this new trend on TikTok. I don't really use TikTok. I don't know if you do, but since this
Right.
since the
I'm not even
SCOTUS,
on Instagram because Instagram deleted my account, and so did Facebook. And after that, I just
you
never.
just gave up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure more of that is coming with the Ministry of Truth. But from what I understand, there's a new trend on TikTok since this SCOTUS leak emerged. And it's videos of young American women trying to encourage men to support them in protesting to keep Roe legal. They basically say, if SCOTUS overturns this 1973 ruling, that casual sex and hookup culture would be decimated. So men should be as equally outraged as these young women. My question to you: how is this sort of sentiment by American women perceived by people in Iran? What do they think of American culture in that regard? And I would venture to say that since you're a university professor, you talk to young people there. What do they think?
Well, there are many views in Iran. It's very diverse. If you sit in a taxi driver, if you sit in a taxi, you'll hear the driver say, different drivers say almost anything. And Iranians, I would say, are in general very critical. That's their so if you sit with a group of Iranians since childhood, I believe, you'll rarely hear them say, how good things are. They'll usually say how terrible things are. And so that's a part of our culture. I would say, though, I think that according to the last polls that I saw a few months ago, roughly 90% of Iranians consider themselves to be religious.
Mhm.
Although that 90%, some of them view themselves to be very religious, some somewhat religious. And even that definition of what actually constitutes being religious is different for different people. So it really doesn't mean the same thing for different people. If I say I'm very religious and you say you're very religious, it may not mean the same thing.
Right.
So we have to keep that in mind. But most Iranians uh, would look unfavorably, I think overwhelmingly, and again, that's a relative term, towards casual sex. And so defining abortion within that context wouldn't be looked upon favorably, although I am very sure that there is a minority that thinks otherwise.
Oh, I'm sure. As you said, Eastern culture. I mean, my family obviously hails from Far East. Eastern culture is generally more conservative than that of the West. Iran's stance, it sounds like, on abortion pretty much falls right in line with the rest of Asia, Central Asia, Western Asia, um, with all those countries. It's just a matter of law. But now, following this leak, Democrats on the Hill are rushing to codify Roe. Do you believe laws created by a country shape that country's culture, their pop culture?
That would be very complicated, and I think they definitely have an impact. Um, Without a doubt, I think that the trajectory of American and European culture is very much influenced by liberal capitalism and the changes that have been brought about as a result over a very long period of time. And of course, the changes in the non-Western culture have that have been brought about are sometimes or and often influenced by uh, pop culture in the West or culture or Western culture. So you will see elites, for example, in Iran. Many of them are liberal and pro-Western. And one of the problems is that often Western reporters, Western journalists, Western um, diplomats in embassies or international bodies, they have they mostly are in contact with like-minded Iranians, and so they come to the conclusion that Iranians think like they do, and that they're pro-West, and they don't take into account that most Iranians probably don't think that way, and most probably most Iranians are not as influenced by Western culture and Western society. So Western culture and society is very much influenced by, I think, Western laws, and of course in a liberal capitalist society, and it even influences our part of the world because of the sheer power of Western media and,
Mhm.
for example, the Persian language media that broadcasts into Iran from the West, that's owned by Western governments or controlled by Western governments. And I think the same is true in Iran. The laws in Iran do influence culture, but I don't think that laws, of course, can definitely, they don't, they're not, they don't create absolute monoliths in society. You will, if the whether the laws are good or bad, there will definitely be discontent in societies, and that discontent could shape the future of those societies. So it's a very complicated issue, I'm sure, everywhere in the world. And there's no easy answer to that question.
Yeah,
I don't know if that made sense.
well, I would agree. I'm not sure. I can't tell if culture influences law or law influences culture. It's like a chicken or the egg argument, but they certainly reflect one another. I'm not sure which one comes first. But a lot of people, I think, would argue that the more permissive the laws, the more degenerative the society, as we're seeing, like bedlam in Los Angeles or California with the drug culture and homelessness, and because the laws have been so laxed and there's no punishment basically. So for me, it's hard to say, but they definitely reflect one another, I would say.
But also,
But
the laws are often, I mean, they're linked to the dominant ideology of the ruling class, and in a
right
society
at
like
that time frame.
yes, and so in the United States, if whether it's Democratic or Republican, it is a liberal capitalist country, more or less, and therefore the social issues like social justice are not really seen in the United States as they would be seen in much of the rest of the world. So, for example, I believe that in Iran, the general political environment is more leftist. Looking at it from a Western, let's say, using Western terminology, I don't think left right really works in Iran. But let's say, social justice is much more important in the popular uh, discussion in Iran than it would be in the United States. Hence, the law in Iran where pregnant women who have a child get 1 year leave. I think in Iran that is something that people think is what the state should do. And whereas in the United States, I think at least the way in which the media and which is controlled by the powers that exist, they would probably push people into believing that 1 year leave is not good, and this is doesn't it keeps society back, and they have a very different way of
Well, it's capitalist, right? They want to
yes,
push us women back into the workforce as fast as we can to produce
that's right, that's
rather
right.
than care for our children. So,
And of course, it's not just women. You can look at it from very different angles. Universal health care in a society like the United States would be expected. And it's something that many Iranians uh, expect as well, even though in Iran there isn't universal health care, but they try to move in that direction. And it's mostly because of the sanctions that they haven't been able to achieve that. But the ideal in Iran would definitely be universal healthcare. Again, it's something that someone like myself and like I think most Iranians would expect. Whereas in the United States, maybe, it would be different under different circumstances. Although I think right now the United States is changing. It's a very different country than when it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
yeah, it has certainly changed very quickly. Um, I mean,
Very
within my lifetime. And Professor, last thing here is I think it's fair to say the 20th century was shaped by American pop culture. But now, more and more, we're seeing a shift towards Eastern pop culture. Look no further than the explosion of K pop all over the world. Given that the whole of Asia is literally where most of the world's population lives, do you then think the 21st century will be shaped by the East?
Well, the East, first of all, is, as you know, very diverse. And you and I are both Asian. And just from looking at the screen, your viewers can tell that there's a great deal of diversity just by seeing the two of us.
Yes.
And even countries like Iran, which are in West Asia, not the whole of Asia, a country like Iran is very diverse. In fact, one of the interesting things that always I can't say astonishes me. Maybe once upon a time it did, but is that in the United States and Europe, they often think that of Iran in the terms of like the Taliban or these other groups. And the irony, of course, is that groups like the Taliban, Al Qaeda, or Al Qaeda, as they say here, and ISIS and others, these groups were either actually created by the United States or the United States was a part of their creation alongside the Saudis or alongside Turkish intelligence, as we saw in Syria and Iraq, and the Israeli regime as well. So many of these ideologies that ordinary Americans seem to attribute to Iran because of the media, they're actually those have nothing to do with Iran, and they are linked. They are, and many of them are linked to the United States.
Yeah,
Sort
they're
of like,
created by the US.
yes, just like what I just like what we're seeing now in Europe, regardless of what one thinks about the war in Ukraine, but the fact that the United States and its allies are fighting side by side with neo-Nazis, fascists, and of course that they're not representative of all of Ukraine,
Right.
but it's sort of like what the United States did in our part of the world. So many people think that Iran is like the Taliban, but the irony is that Iran is very different infinitely different from the Taliban, and the Taliban is more closely associated with the United States itself, for reasons that I explained earlier, than it is with a country like Iran. But I do think that the world is changing very fast, and that the United States and its allies are losing clout and influence at an astonishing rate. And it's their own fault. It's the infinite wars that we've been seeing since 9/11 that have intensified this, the nature of capitalism, which is diminishing the middle class in the West, which I think was the strong point or the strength of Western societies. And of course, uh, the fact that the United States and Europe treat the rest of the world with arrogance. They fail to respect other countries. So they 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 try to isolate Iran. They try to isolate Russia. They try to isolate China. And I'm speaking about before the war.
Yes.
They try to isolate all sorts of it. And then what they basically do is they're pushing all these countries that they isolate towards each other. And because of their arrogance, they fail to realize that at some point this is leading to their own isolation. And in this war in Ukraine, and there's no real good versus bad here, because the role that NATO played, the coup, supporting neo-Nazis, they have at least as much to blame. They should be blamed as much as the Russians, if not more, for this war. But basically, they've created during this war. We've seen much of the global South, more powerful countries, not the small ones, but the powerful countries, they've refused to take sides with
Yes.
Western powers. And I think this is reflective of that arrogance and that inability to communicate and to respect other countries and other peoples. And people, of course, see all the wars that they've carried out in our part of the world, and then how they do a lot worse than what's going on in Ukraine and Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, in Yemen, and elsewhere, in Syria. And then when it comes to a very white European country, we see that the Western media is suddenly outraged.
Yes.
And yet when it comes to these other countries, they're indifferent because their governments are deeply involved. So they are leading. I think they're pushing. They are pushing this trend themselves. They are intensifying the pace in which the world is moving towards Asia. But of course, Asia, as you pointed out, it is enormous.
Yes, I do believe that the 20th century, I think we can concede the 20th century was about US global hegemony. I don't believe the 21st century will still belong to the US. I think the the era of hegemony is over. And I think a lot of that is actually being fought. I hate to say it, I don't use it, but on TikTok. I think a lot of that is you see the young people. I mean, TikTok is an advent of China, and you see the Chinese moving forward with so much technology and building bridges, literally, and roads within intercontinental Asia as well as into Africa, and not getting involved in these endless wars. I think it's pretty clear that one side is building roads while the other side is bombing. Professor Mohammad Marandi, always appreciate your insight. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Manila Chan Reports and Slanted Online's YouTube channels to keep up with all the news minus the slant. I'm Manila Chan for Slanted Online.